Myanmar is at risk of collapse. The long civil war has taken a major turn, and Thailand is in the firing line.
Myanmar's rebel forces have claimed another victory against a military-run government. It has declared control over Myawaddy, a key town near the Thai border. Around 200 Myanmar military personnel have withdrawn to a bridge connecting the trade hub to Thailand.
More than 300 Myanmar security force personnel are now in the custody of Bangladesh border guards.
During the current crisis unfolding in Myanmar, events are happening so fast it can feel challenging just to keep up with them. And we're working to increase our podcast production to stay abreast of this ever-changing crisis. And besides our podcast, we encourage you to check out the blogs on our website, insightmyanmar.org, where you can also sign up for our regular newsletter. And you can follow our social media sites. Just look for Insight Myanmar on your preferred social media platform. With that, let's head into our show.
Today I'm joined by Tim McLaughlin, who's going to be giving us a bit of a journalistic perspective on issues such as US engagement. And we've actually got an article here from Tim, published in The Atlantic, if I remember correctly, that we'll be referencing throughout, which we will link below, possibly alongside some other pieces. But before we get into that, Tim, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Tim McLaughlin. I'm a journalist. I currently am based in Singapore, but previously, before Singapore, I'd spent a number of years in Myanmar working for the Myanmar Times, and then freelancing for a while, and then working for Reuters when they opened the bureau there first. So I was based there from around 2012 to 2016. And then now in the region, and I've kind of been, dipping in and out of Myanmar since 2012, although not recently with the coup.
It's interesting. Just before we delve into the actual articles themselves, 2012 to 2016. That's a fascinating time to be there, and I'm really interested to hear your perspective, because 2016 was actually the year that I started living in Myanmar. And so I feel that I caught the tail end of that sort of faux democracy period. But looking at that 2012 to 2016 period, what was it like? Did you see a lot of progress in the country during that period of time? Did you see any sort of, how should I say this, any optimism among the people? Because if I remember correctly, a lot of that time was still dominated by the Thein Sein government, which was one step removed from the military, but it was notionally a time of broadening and opening the country. Like, what was it like living there during that time?
Yeah, so I had first gone to Yangon in 2010 before the elections, and then was only there for a little bit, and then I was trying to figure out how to move back there permanently and find a job, which was a bit of a challenge at the time in journalism. But I ended up working at the Myanmar Times starting in 2012, right before I think I got there. Probably I think there was by-elections that year. Certainly I think a lot of excitement, and I think now looking back, it's easy to kind of write off the period as kind of that it was a sham or the changes weren't what people anticipated. But I think it's important to remember that at the time, there were a lot of changes happening that were perhaps not like in the direct political sense, but also, economic. I think, there was the breakup of the telecoms monopoly, which made it much, much cheaper for people to have, cell phones, internet, SIM cards. The banking system started to shift. When I arrived, they were still giving out FEC, foreign exchange notes. They started to float the chat. There were some other changes kind of with the central bank. So yeah, I mean, all that stuff, the economic stuff was certainly happening. I think now, when we look back, people, it's easier to kind of look at that period darkly and dismiss it and say it was kind of a mirage. I do think there was real, there were some real things happening, and definitely benefits for people. Was it sort of like equal across the board, right? Of course not. And was it halting? Yes, for sure. Because also in that time period, some really bad stuff happened, right? There was the breakdown the year before of the peace agreement, or the ceasefire rather, with the KIA. There was in 2012 and 2013, of course, anti-Muslim violence in various places. There were some things with the Rohingya. So yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't all sort of amazing and great. But it also wasn't, all, terrible. There was some benefits for people living there, some tangible things happening. And again, I think these things, development and openings of countries, they happen at different levels for different people. People that were already in positions of power in the economy did get fantastically wealthy. Some people certainly didn't, see the benefits in the same way. So I when I write about it now or describe it now, I often say it was kind of like halting and uneven, and I think that's kind of a good way to think about it. But I think when we look at halting and uneven, the general projection and general feeling was one of, positivity, especially leading into probably the 2015 election. Right. I mean, there was just like huge amount of excitement and kind of hype around that. Many people getting to vote for the first time, and certainly getting to vote for the NLD in a election that was open and free in that way. So yeah, I mean, I think that those years were certainly a lot of at least optimism about the general direction of the country. It's never, trend line's never like directly straight. There was ups and downs there.
Mm. And I think that definitely captures a lot of the history of Myanmar, and in fact, a lot of the history of many troubled countries, where you write the history books and you try to write them in a very linear fashion of like, well, things were bad and then things got better and this is what happened. But you're right; it's very sort of forward and back, and sometimes it moves to the side. It's a bit, yeah, it's a bit difficult to predict what's going to happen. But your article here, the Great Democratic Success Story That Wasn't, which I like the title, by the way. You're talking a lot about the U.S. policy towards Myanmar, and you talk quite heavily here about Kurt Campbell as well, who's the Assistant Secretary of State, previous Assistant Secretary of State. So you're focusing on the U.S. a lot. How would you categorize the U.S.'s response to the Myanmar crisis to date? Has the U.S., in your view, done effectively nothing but lip service, or has the U.S. done things that are significant? Because the thrust of your article sounds like the U.S. has done a lot, it just hasn't done what needs to be done.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of start off back then, post when Obama was elected the first time in 2009, there was this idea that circulated around DC that many people would credit, Kurt Campbell and a few other people with, is that there needed to be a change in policy towards Myanmar, right? That the Bush era stuff of just kind of like cutting the place off and smashing it with sanctions like wasn't working. And this is obviously part of the broader kind of Obama open hand, reaching out to sort of pariah states, right? Like there was trying to be engagement, obviously, with the Iran deal is the one that gets the most coverage, but then there was obviously Cuba and Myanmar. It was kind of this, like, let's see if there's a new way. And I generally think that was probably, again, the overarching idea behind it was probably smart. Like the U.S. policy towards Myanmar, it wasn't accomplishing much, right? Like the country was just saddled with sanctions. It was incredibly, poverty levels, all of this stuff, it was just kind of sitting there, and the U.S. wasn't really doing much aside from kind of just like every once in a while re-upping the kind of crushing financial burdens that it had put on the place. So I think it was smart to kind of like, or at least I understand the idea behind kind of re-engagement and kind of looking back at the country and trying to figure out a new path forward, because obviously the old path wasn't working. So I think that's what led us to 2010 to 2012, where there was this huge kind of burst of U.S. Interest in the country, and I think that was genuine. I think it came from the top. I think people like Hillary Clinton and Obama and Jake Sullivan, these were people who were genuinely interested in in Myanmar. I don't think they would spend so much time going there and stuff if that wasn't the case. They're busy people, obviously. So I think that is kind of leads us up to a little bit, and then obviously I think the complicating factor with Myanmar is in 2016, 2017, what happened with the Rohingya, the civilian side of the government's response to that. I think, it didn't totally sour DC on Suu Kyi, but certainly turned off some people. And I think had people thinking like, okay, we've invested a lot of time and energy in here. And like, what's the, what's sort of the end goal, or what's the development? So then, and that's a very vast way of putting this all out there. There's obviously a lot more writing and reporting and books about this, but yeah, I think, then it gets to the coup. And I think the general sense that I get is that the United States, along with a lot of other people, thought that the coup happened and it would pretty much be a few months of kind of protests and maybe some small skirmishes. And then the military would just kind of crush the, resistance, as they have often done in the past. Right. I don't think the U.S. or many other people foresaw sort of the protracted, fighting and resistance to the junta that we've seen for the past couple of years. And so I think initially the U.S. And a few other countries didn't really do all that much, and also I think they were probably surprised by this. I can't say that definitively, but I think most people were surprised by the fact that the military, which had a great deal for itself, right? It had amazing control of three ministries. It had, still had its hand in all this economic stuff. I mean, the coup from many, many ways just makes no sense if you think about it, as a logical, like rational actor, which I don't think Min Online can be, described as that. So, so I think the initial kind of response from the U.S. is a bit of a scramble. There were some sanctions early on and stuff, but I think those were very sort of like performative. And I think there's a bigger, broader question to be had about kind of like, what can sanctions accomplish and what can they not accomplish? Are we trying to sort of like change people's actions, or trying to, punish people? I think in this case, it seems like punishment is the goal, because I'm not sure people believe that sanctions would actually make the junta kind of revert course. It certainly, in the past had not. They had weathered these things, for many, many years, and much worse ones than what they're seeing now. And so, I think the thrust, or what I wanted to kind of point out in the story, is that a lot of these people from the Obama administration are back in very high-ranking places of power now with Biden. Some of them higher up than they were before. These were the people who apparently, crafted this policy towards Myanmar, and had, they give themselves a lot of credit, probably way too much credit. If you look back at their own writings about kind of shifting the mindset of the generals, I don't think they really, I think at the end of the day, the generals are the ones who make these decisions. But I do think there was this high level of, interest and engagement on Myanmar that we just, after the coup, it certainly seemed like the U.S. would rather just kind of like, I don't want to say walk away, but maybe not pay so much attention to kind of, the situation that's unfolding. And I should say that I don't think anybody's happy with what's going on. I don't think, early on there's this narrative that like Beijing is really pleased about this. It's not. The situation in Myanmar is a mess for everybody, not just the countries on its borders, but the countries that are 2 or 3 ones removed. I mean, this has become essentially like a global issue when you take into account cyber scams and drug trade and human trafficking and all the issues that are emanating from Myanmar that just kind of radiates out across the region, right? And so my main thing was just to kind of call attention, I think, to these people who, were these great champions. They claimed that they had changed everything in Myanmar, that they forged this new U.S. policy, and now they pretty much just have walked away from this issue. I feel like they wanted to say that they had done it, and they ticked the box, and it was a gold star for the U.S. And now that things are difficult, like, where is that high level of attention? Where is that high level of talking about the problems? Where is that sort of interest that we saw before? And it certainly doesn't seem to be there at the moment. The second piece of maybe what I wanted to say in the back end of the story was that it's probably time, and I know this is happening on some levels, but for a rethink of sort of like what, it's been 20 years, essentially 2003, really 20-ish years since the really harsh financial sanctions were put on Myanmar. It's been about 15 years or so since the U.S. started this sort of, change in position. And I think it's probably time to look at another sort of, way forward here, because obviously the situation has changed dramatically on the ground. One of the things I pointed out is the U.S. keeps talking about, returning Burma to a path to democracy. Like, that path, in my mind, was already at a dead end before the coup. There was no changes to the constitution. The military still had its unelected MPs. They still had control of the 3 ministries. I mean, we were heading into there was already a second election where there hadn't been, that path had stopped, right? And so I think there's, the other, like I said, the back end was just that there might need to be a rethink here of kind of like what the future of Myanmar looks like, who the actors will be, what that path, quote unquote, path to democracy, if it exists, what it looks like.
And so I want to focus on the sanctions as well. But before we do that, I want to just touch on what you said about China, because I completely agree with you. There was a lot of discourse around China being happy about this. And in fact, early on, 2021, 2022, I was exposed to content on YouTube by English language shills of the CCP, effectively arguing that the coup is a good thing, that the people of Myanmar do not want their democratically elected leaders, that in fact the NLD are puppets of the US, whatever is Department of State, and that essentially the coup is the opportunity for the military representing the real people of Myanmar to restore genuine Myanmar control over their own country, and all of this sort of narrative. So it was clear that the Chinese, very early on, when they thought that the military would have a relatively easy time of establishing a dictatorship again, were keen, because of course the trade opportunities were there. But then the country devolved into civil war. As we've seen with the scam centers that you mentioned as well, the Chinese have very, very, very much cooled their attitudes towards this. They're not happy about chaos. Now, I'm just wondering, does the Chinese role within Myanmar actually get people in the United States administration sort of alert and focused? Because it feels like it's pretty obvious that China is very interested in Myanmar. It's obviously economically, it has massive potential. Strategically, it's very important. It's right on their border. It allows them to flank India. It allows them to flank Thailand, which is a U.S. ally. It gives them sea access west of the Strait of Malacca and so on. It seems like this would be something that the U.S. would be interested in far beyond just the intrinsic humanitarian and political value of Myanmar itself, but rather as a key chess piece in a much larger geostrategic game. But we don't seem to see the same amount of urgency and pressure when it comes to Myanmar that we might see, for example, when we're looking at conflicts in the South China Sea. So is there a reason for that discrepancy?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think back to your original point, right? When the coup, first happened, this kind of narrative that unspooled, it makes it sound like Suu Kyi and the NLD were really acrimonious to China. I mean, they were not, right? I mean, they were very, very, very accommodating of China. Mm-hmm. Even before Suu Kyi was in power, she was very accommodating of China. When you look at the Lepidon project and the commission that she ran that found that there was really kind of no wrongdoing there, NLD people had been going to China for years now on these trips, some of them on lots and lots and lots of these junkets. Tinchal went there and reaffirmed that reaffirmed that Myanmar and the NLD, agreed with China's position on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, right? So, I mean, the NLD was very close to China, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the first misnomer, is that they were kind of pushing back or something like that. I mean, they weren't, right? And so there was certainly an attempt to kind of undo some of these kind of perhaps bad economic deals that the then same government had got into, but on the economic front. But politically, I think they were very much, getting along just fine. And so the coup obviously upended all of that, right? It puts a huge amount of uncertainty at the beginning, which then turned into outright, massive, fighting and displacement and war that we see now. And you're right? I mean, Myanmar can't change its neighbors, and they're on the border. There is obviously the pipeline. There's Chaopu. There are a lot of projects that China has invested a lot of time and interest in that are in Myanmar that I'm sure that they would like to see protected and to see those in return on investment and kind of return on the goods there. So that's certainly part of it. And you're right as well, right? I don't want to flatten kind of the Myanmar's kind of existence to between China and the U.S. as this kind of football, but it would be also naive to say that doesn't play a role in it. And we saw that when the U.S. decided to say that the military, they had found grounds that they had carried out the operations against the Rohingya, I think genocidal intent or however they phrased it, the genocide declaration that Blinken made. We know that the U.S. didn't do that before in the Trump administration because they were afraid that it would push Myanmar closer towards China. So that decision to kind of slow play and softball a little bit the voicing of issues and certainly the genocide declaration from the Trump admin, we know that comes from people. It's on the record in stories that I've written with named sources of people saying that the administration didn't want to do that because they were afraid that it would push Myanmar even further into China's hands. So there's definitely a thought process here about China and China's position. Yes, I mean, to your point, I do find it a bit. I guess maybe there's an argument to be made, one that I haven't fleshed out totally myself, but I think it's a little bit in the recent ICG report and some other academic writing is that the U.S. and China on Myanmar. They have very different sort of, I think probably kind of visions and wants from the country, but they're both in the boat right now and having to deal with this, with the junta, with the instability, right? So at least for the moment, they both have the same kind of problems on their hand. Obviously, it's different for both countries given their proximity and their relationship and their investments in the country. So there might be a little bit of sort of, shared unhappiness. And we saw that. We saw Blinken did speak to Wang Yi about Myanmar when he met him in Bangkok, I believe, a couple months ago. And I think that was in January. And it was at the bottom of the readout, way down at the bottom. So maybe there have been a little bit of chat about it. But yes, ultimately, like you said, I do find it kind of interesting that the situation, certainly if you believe what the government is saying, the U.S. government, that they're kind of trying to reorient itself. Obviously, it's been upended a bit by the situation in Gaza, but to reorient back to Asia, to focus there, that the U.S.'s greatest competitor and perhaps existential threat, according to some, is China. You would certainly think that a country that's in Asia that is kind of at the nexus of China, at least geographically, would be getting sort of more attention from the U.S. admin, if only in a sort of self-serving, kind of way there.
I mean, I recognize what you're saying with regards to this self-serving approach, and that kind of underlies all international politics. At the end of the day, everything that we're doing, even when we're doing good, we are doing first and foremost for ourselves and our constituents. But yeah. But that's to be expected. But there is, I think, a lot of value to be had. And you yourself in the article, like you're hinting at it. Like you're not necessarily outright saying that Myanmar will be the first domino to fall and start a wave of democracy in the region, because that's not quite, um, it's not an easy statement to make. And I think George Bush made that mistake, believing that an invasion in Iraq was going to trigger a wave of democratic reforms throughout the Middle East. But you seem to be implying that there is great potential if Myanmar becomes a democratic success story. There is great potential for this to have deep ramifications across the Southeast Asian sphere, and certainly Thailand is, I mean, a sort of kind of military dictatorship. They're trying to dress it up real nice, but let's be honest, we can see what's going on. Singapore is a police state controlled by a small group of very wealthy people. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, military dictatorships. Is this something, separate from the China angle? Is this an angle that is exciting people within the administration? This possibility of the dominoes starting to fall, and the message being sent to these people that, like, hey, even without Western intervention, even without Western help and money and weapons and boots on the ground, you can just rise up and overthrow a military dictatorship if you don't like it. You can just have democracy by yourself. You can do that. Is that making people sort of ears prick up?
No. I think like, look, I think that the U.S. At the moment, certainly the U.S.'s main focus on China is, and also you see this probably with India is as well, and the interest of the U.S. interest in India, that they're kind of willing to let a lot of other places slide on their own issues as long as you take the position that the U.S. wants on China, which is against China, right? I think if there would be a lot more criticism of a lot more places, and for the way that they're acting domestically from the U.S., if they are, seen as kind of not going with the U.S. on its current kind of way against China, right? I think the U.S. is like totally fine with the situation in Thailand. I mean, we heard it the other day on a call that I was on from someone at the State Department, saying that relations with Thailand have never been better. This is the strongest they've ever been for the U.S. So I think they don't really care about that. I think the overarching issue seems to be sort of like where countries in this region fall on China, and that kind of seems to be where the tally is kept. And that certainly kind of jives with this, again, thought that China is this competitor and certainly is this massive threat to the United States, and threat to kind of like the way of life and kind of global order. So that seems to be the main issue right now. And I think to your point about democracy in the region, I think that there's sometimes this people saying like, oh, democracy is in decline. I think when we look around Southeast Asia, it's not really in decline; it's just being suppressed. I think in Thailand, obviously, the prime minister who now is the prime minister shouldn't be. He's not the guy anybody that people voted for. Would move forward, kind of maybe being dissolved at some point. Obviously, the situation in Myanmar, is not what what people want it to be. The will of the people there not being kind of respected. So I think when you look around the region, you could, if you want to go further, you could look at the situation in Hong Kong where you had these massive protests which were ignored, and then there was this massive crackdown. So yeah, I think that there is, again, this idea of like democracy in decline or backsliding. But that's not really how I see it. I see it as like the people at top just forcing people, to accept the powers that be, which is unfortunately what's happening in a couple places right now.
Fair enough. And so let's actually look at what has been done. So the sanctions and aid are two very interesting sides of one coin. It seems like it's almost a binary when it comes to foreign policy. That there's, on the one hand, you've got cutting someone off, like let's isolate them, let's not recognize them, let's not let them visit the country, let's sanction them, and all that sort of stuff. And then the other end of the spectrum, you've got, well, let's give them opportunities and prestige and meet with them on the world stage and give them aid and give them financial benefits and special deals and free trade and what have you. And it's kind of weird because you don't really have many situations where you just use one or the other. I think I may be wrong, but I believe the United States even gave North Korea significant amounts of relief aid while simultaneously putting the country under very heavy sanctions. That the two seem to play together. And in Myanmar's case, you have heavy sanctions being reimposed on the country, and you also have aid being given to the country, and we've seen acquisitions in the scope of hundreds of millions of dollars through the NDAA and the Burma Act. So it seems that both is going on. So let's focus on the sanctions first. You're talking about these crippling sanctions, but one thing that consistently stood out, even since the coup of 2021, it took years and years and years and years for the US to get over this, is carving out special exemptions for things like the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise when it came to doling out those sanctions or sanctioning very specific enterprises and very specific individuals within those enterprises in ways that were relatively easy to circumvent. So was the US really serious about the sanctions for the first few years of the coup, or was that more of just a performative sort of message?
Yeah. So I think there's a difference here when I talk about crippling sanctions. I think, that's certainly the sort of, I think, Bush era, when like the entire country was being designated and was under sanctions. What they're doing now, I guess, is in diplomacy speak, is targeted sanctions is the way that the U.S. likes to frame it, right? Yeah, and I would largely agree. I think at the beginning of the situation, post coup, yeah, there was some sort of, let's throw some names on the list, put out a press release, like they'll write stories about it, say they're kind of trying to tighten the screws on Myanmar. Yeah, that's just, and I think at the beginning, a lot of these decisions were like fairly performative. They were kind of, people maybe of like not that much importance that we sort of like whose names are kind of widely known. I don't think that they were really sort of meant to like immediately and as certainly as fast as possible kind of like cut off the economic lifeline to the junta, or to really punish the people that were kind of like obviously helping them out. Yeah, I think the oil and gas situation, is another one that I know has gotten a lot of focus. I haven't written about it specifically, but I think the oil and gas industry in Myanmar, going back to the, even 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, has been contentious in terms of like whether people should be operating there or not operating there. Obviously we saw Chevron has been trying to exit for a long time, and the sanctions on MOGE, and the gas enterprise. I think the issue that I see there with that stuff is that Thailand is a major U.S. ally. They're right next door. A lot of their gas is coming from Myanmar. So it becomes an international kind of issue. It's not just kind of internal to Myanmar when you start, I think, tinkering with that stuff. And so I think that certainly is part of perhaps what is kind of weighing on on U.S. decisions a little bit, is kind of the neighbors there, and kind of what impact it would have if they really unleashed this stuff on them. And then I think, look, overall, there's a question of kind of like, can sanctions work in the way that they are intended to, in the current environment? Look at the situation in Russia. I mean, the U.S. really threw everything they had at them, and people were saying, oh, it's going to crater the economy. It's going to be like, 1992 there, post breakup of the USSR. They're doing all right, because there's a lot of actors who don't abide by these, right? And so, I think the situation with sanctions is sort of globally evolving. And there's probably a bigger questions and discussions to be had about their overall effectiveness, not just in Myanmar, but in other countries, right? When Myanmar was first facing these, the really kind of tough sanctions back in 2003, whether you agreed with them or not, and you thought they were effective, the country was certainly less integrated into the global economy than it is now. And now they're more integrated. They are certainly have more connections to the outside world. There's more big businesses there. I think we haven't seen a lot of the big companies kind of like bail out of Myanmar like they had in the past, right? Coke is still there. Carlsberg's still there. These companies like, back in the early 2000s, again, when there was this huge Burma interest and push, those companies all, left the country, which is why in 2012 we had all these kind of homecoming ceremonies for them. So yeah, it's just a different, it's a different economy now. It's a different country now. That 10 years of sort of liberalization, openness, quasi-democracy, whatever people want to use to phrase it, the economic changes were big, right? And so I think there's a bigger question to be had about discussions we had globally about kind of like, do sanctions, can they do what they want to do? Are they for punishment? Are they for behavioral change? Again, like I said, in this situation, it seems like it's just for punishment and for trying to kind of cut off some of the monetary funds. And then in terms of monetary, like, the money, I think, Myanmar has obviously a liquidity and cash crunch. How much of that can be ascribed to the sanctions? I'm not sure if we could put like a figure on that. I mean, I think the junta has been very good at running its own economy terribly, as they have before, right? And so, part of the blame on kind of what's going on there and the forex issues is the fact that they have no idea what they're doing, and they put a lot of the people who knew how the economy ran in jail, and now they have a bunch of generals doing it. So I think it's kind of an amalgamation of these things too.
Okay, fair enough. So let's then flip to the other side, and this is the aid side, which may be a little bit more controversial. I think, and it's kind of ironic in a sense, because you can get sanctions through the people. It may be difficult to get sanctions through the establishment and Congress, but you can get sanctions through to the people and say, well, we're going to not do business with this country. We're going to sanction these people. We're going to sanction these individuals. And people, I think, generally seem to accept that as like, well, okay, that makes sense. Like, we don't want to be giving money to people who are bad.
Yeah.
But when it comes to aid, you're saying, well, we're going to be giving resources to people who are good. I think all of a sudden questions start getting asked, like, well, how do you know that they're good, or how do you know that the money's not going to get intercepted, and all this sort of stuff. So what does U.S. aid policy look like? Because it's very contentious. No one is even willing to breathe the phrase lethal aid. No one is willing to actually put boots on the ground, whether that would be military boots on the ground, whether that would be, even like peacekeepers, or whether it would just be aid workers. Nobody wants to engage in those serious ways. But there is quite a substantial amount of aid going through, because we've got tens of millions of people suffering from acute food shortage. We don't have shelter, and so on and so on and so forth. So what is the aid situation like? And more importantly, what is the discourse around aid like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you might have had him on here, Tom Anders, right, at the UN.
Yep.
He's talked a lot about this, about how, there's a lot of, humanitarian aid stuff for Myanmar, and the crisis is coming because the junta is either unwilling or unable, or doesn't want to deliver it to the areas that it needs to get to, which is not, frankly, surprising. We've seen, for even again going back to 2012 and the kind of mirage that was happening there, that the military has for decades in Myanmar used humanitarian aid as a tool, against the people that it doesn't want to get it, to hold it over the heads of diplomats and international organizations, whether that's through kind of denying them travel permits to certain places, not letting them bring certain things to certain places. This is a kind of a long running battle of kind of like how to get stuff from A to B. I think the conversation happening now, and frankly, not to be down on my own piece, but what I said about the U.S. aid from the United States, humanitarian aid, sort of goes through actors, local partners I should say partners in Myanmar, through the UN, through the World Food Program, for many years now, even before the coup, because the aid situation in Myanmar, I think, was so complicated and very contentious. There was discussions on a multitude of things. One of the topics that I think that was covered and brought up a lot by people was engaging local actors, local organizations, to handle kind of aid distribution or be the facilitators of aid delivery, rather than going through the big international organizations who are kind of beholden, in now, not then, the powers that be, which is now the military, right? And so, these are things that people in the aid world, have been talking about for a long time. It seems like that discussion, the discussion is happening more now. It seems like now would be probably a time when people would all agree that would be a good thing to do, right? Because right now, again, a lot of humanitarian aid, it's dictated where it can go and how it can go and when it can go by the military, right? Because it's coming through international organizations that are still like working through those formal channels in Myanmar. So I guess, again, wasn't anything kind of like revolutionary. What I pointed out in the piece, and which other people from aid organizations have pointed out in much more detail, is that maybe it's time to start thinking about kind of like how to get these aid to places through local actors, cross border, not through the formal channels that have been obviously controlled by the military and disrupted by the military and kind of used as a weapon by the military in some ways. And I think that's probably a good discussion to be having. Some people reacted to my piece saying I wanted like white messiahs to return to Myanmar. That's, I don't think localizing humanitarian aid is not calling for white messiahs to return to Myanmar if they were ever there to begin with. It was about trying to get, thinking more creatively about the situation on the ground and how you can get desperately needed food aid and medical aid to people who are in positions that are very precarious and that are seen as kind of enemies of the junta.
And I think you've touched on an issue that's really prescient and salient, because the issue with aid has been this: the official channels are controlled by the junta, and this is something that we saw ASEAN definitely falling prey to when they would say, "Well, we'll give aid," and it's like, but the aid that you're giving is being seized by the military and is then being sold in markets to raise money to continue perpetuating the violence for which you were giving the aid in the first place.
Right.
The irony.
And again, it's not. I don't think anyone should be shocked by this. That's the part that I find kind of befuddling, because it's like this has been their MO for years, right? Even in the good times, if you talk to, and you've probably had them on the podcast, various people who've worked in, Rakhine in particular, Kachin, always facing restrictions from the military controlled, bits of the even the kind of quasi civilian government, right? Of where they can go, needing for travel permits, all of this stuff, right? So the fact that they're doing it worse now, I'm surprised that people are surprised by that, because they have been kind of weaponizing and using aid in the way that they want for a very long time.
Yes, and I think that's, but this is the issue, and so it comes down to a larger topic that I also want to cover, which is the concept of legitimacy and the recognition. There's a very strong hesitance that I have perceived, and this has just been the consistent theme. There's a very strong hesitancy to do anything that is perceived as illegitimate or is perceived as being completely unilateral. Everyone wants to appeal to a higher order, a higher authority, a higher system, because I mean, when things went sideways in various military engagements and various peacekeeping engagements over the last, say, half century, the blame falls on the politicians and the policymakers who decided to go in the first place, and they want to avoid that negative blame. You can't be blamed for a war that you didn't get involved in. You can't be blamed for the life that you didn't save, but you can be blamed for the life that you objectively made worse. So that seems to be the thing. And everyone's like, well, but we don't want to bypass the military because that would be illegitimate. That would not be the correct and appropriate way to go about this. We don't want to be accused of favoritism, and we don't want to be accused of recognizing the revolutionary forces as legitimate actors and all this sort of stuff. But the alternative to that is to basically just dump aid in the hands of the military. Like, how are policymakers navigating this little quagmire they find themselves in?
Yeah, certainly. And I think Myanmar presents a challenge because of the kind of fractured nature of things. Obviously, I think probably listeners to the podcast here are more engaged than most people kind of on the country or on the topics that we're discussing. But, certainly from an outsider looking in, or even someone that knows a little bit about the country looking in, there are this plethora of kind of groups, right? There's the NUG right now, then there's the PDFs, then there's the EAOs, and then there's militias, and then there's, all this stuff kind of piles up, right? And so I think that there sort of tends to be, and we discussed this in the pre-interview I did for this a little bit, this, when it comes to Myanmar, to kind of people throw up their hands and say, oh, it's like really tough, it's really complicated. And like, yes, it is. Most places that are in the state that Myanmar's in are tough and are complicated. If the solutions were super easy, someone would have done it already. And so, so I think that is kind of what we're seeing a little bit. As someone, when I was doing interviews for the story, said that everyone from Beijing to DC to Bangkok just wants this to go away. And like, and like I understand that feeling, but I also don't think that that's a way to kind of approach the country and policy and kind of trying to at least, I don't think any of these countries are going to bring a big, ultimate fix to Myanmar, but I think to kind of improve the situation, having that mindset that you really hope it just kind of quite vanishes is a bit kind of self-defeating from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I agree. That seems to be the feeling that everyone has, is we want it to go away.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I think it's getting in the way. People just see it as
yeah.
kind of getting in the way of their other stuff that they're doing. And the thing, and like, and I think, um, if Myanmar was kind of, yeah, I mean, I really, and I think, when we look at the situation now, maybe, and there's probably an argument to be made that like it's spiraling so much and becoming this even bigger regional issue because people for the first 3 years didn't really want to try to
Mm,
solve things, right? I mean, maybe that's something that people should delve into and look at, because it's like, could more have been done early on to prevent kind of the current situation now, right? I mean, when you look at the situation in Myanmar, in Thailand, Thailand was okay for a long time, sort of just kind of, you know, going along with what was happening in Myanmar. I think they kind of they were all kind of fingers crossed Min Aung Hlaing would just hold these elections and then they could just move on, right?
mm,
And now it's spilling over your border. So, I think there's definitely some, interesting discussions and probing to be done on kind of looking at, had some things been done earlier, had people taken this more seriously, had people not spent the first 6 months or a year thinking, oh, well, there's no chance these guys are going to be able to hold out a resistance, you know, would the situation be as bad, as it is
mhm.
now? Maybe it would be, but I think that's an interesting question to kind of
Yes.
like grapple with and look at and think about now.
And I think it is a super important thing, because it's not even the question, to my mind, would the coup have gone differently, and would the subsequent revolution have gone differently had we taken action sooner? I think there's an even much, much bigger, much more important question to ask. If the precedent had been established much earlier, that you do not get to overthrow a democratically elected government and then just be recognized and
Yeah.
continue to do trade in weapons, but rather you are going to find yourself fighting against rebels who are openly and overtly backed by foreign governments. Would the coup even have happened in the first instance? I think this is the really big thing. Dictatorships know how the game is played. And I've said this many times. One of my big takeaways from the coup is the realization that isolationist regimes ironically do more to support one another than democracies do.
Mm.
And they know that you'll get letters from the UN. They know that you can get dragged in front of the criminal court, or unlikely, but maybe the ICJ. They know that their names can be dragged through the mud, but they also know that none of these things are actually, at the end of the day, going to stop them from being able to exert control over their people and their territory, and being able to pocket the wealth of the nation for themselves and for their families. The outcome is the same. So they don't fear reproach, because why would they? A piece of paper is not relevant to you. It's not going to stop someone from cashing your checks.
Yeah. And
Um, yeah.
I think to your point, and I brought this up before, is it's not the most massive thing, but I often find it symbolic of kind of where people are thinking about this is, Win Myint is the president of Myanmar, right? I mean, he's listed as the head of state at the UN still.
Mm,
He's in jail and nobody talks about it. Like, there's not even like the US statements, the ASEAN statements. He's got to be the most forgotten president that ever lived. I mean, like, how many heads of states, elected heads of states right now, are currently, have been overthrown or in prison, right? And people can grapple with, and quibble over Suu Kyi and the state counselor position. Okay, set her aside. This guy, again, according to the United Nations, is still the head of the country. And he's vanished, right? And there just seems to be no, I mean, I don't mean to laugh, but it's just kind of crazy to me that
mm.
that it's so little, speaking out about him, or kind of where he's at. And I think that I find that it kind of like probably illustrative of some of the other issues.
And it goes even that actually goes a little bit deeper, because when you like the whole premise of the coup, and early on, like this would have been back in like March or April of 2021. I think it was March 2021. The military trotted out on Myawaddy TV the constitutional lawyers
Yeah.
to basically read their lines and say, well, technically under the Constitution, everything was done lawfully. Power was ceded by the acting president to the military, and there's no actual constitutional issue to this, so there should be no backlash to this. There should be no legal proceedings against this because everything was done within the scope of the 2008 Constitution, corrupted and broken as that Constitution is. But all of that argumentation collapses the moment you ask the question, why was it the acting president and not the actual president who signed the state of emergency? It's like, oh yeah, because we arrested him.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
The rest of your argument is now irrelevant. Like if honestly, this would be like the US, having a situation where someone in the Secret Service shoots the president in the back of the head, and then the vice president's first act as president is to pardon that individual.
Right.
Everyone would say we should probably be investigating this because it feels sus. And that's exactly what happened in Myanmar. And you're right, we're not talking about it enough. And it's not just emblematic of how corrupted and broken the Myanmar system is, but it's also emblematic of how weak and puerile the military's claims of legitimacy are. And yet we are afraid of treading on their toes of legitimacy. We're afraid of saying, well, we're not going to recognize your legitimacy. We're going to recognize the legitimacy of people who actually have popular support and don't make a sport of committing war crimes.
Yeah.
It boggles the mind to me, anyway.
Yeah, no, and I think it's and I think like you're saying, like and all of this, like, and I spoke to you before about this, is I think a reason why you see such intense frustration, and from people in Myanmar, kind of about all of this, right? I mean, I think it was early on, you could see it. I think it's just festered, right? Disappointment and kind of anger at international actors, at the UN, various countries, and I think that's all understandable, right? When your country is kind of like the flavor of the day for 5 years, and you get 2 visits from Obama, and you get and everyone's coming there to write magazine profiles and all this stuff, and then in your time of need, all of that seems to kind of just vanish. You could certainly see why people are angry and why people are upset. And you look around at kind of the more regional actors, and you look at ASEAN, which is kind of like filled with people who seem like kind of okay with the coup, if not outright sort of fine with it. And you understand, I think, why people, in Myanmar, why young people, why everybody there is kind of angry, and feels that they've kind of been jettisoned by the greater kind of international community here, that they were supposed to be kind of this torchbearer for not that long ago.
And I think that's a particularly relevant issue, but it goes, I think, 2 ways. On the one hand, I remember, and it broke my heart, because I lived there, I worked there, I had students there, and I had students contacting me. I was in the West, I left just before COVID closed the borders. So I wasn't in the country when the coup happened, but obviously I had, friends, and I had students and co-workers and so on. And a lot of people are reaching out to me, and there were people who were legitimately asking, like, is the US going to conduct a drone strike and assassinate me online so that democracy can be restored? Is the United Nations or is the United States going to put boots on the ground? Will there be an invasion? Are they going to help resolve this problem? Because obviously Hollywood media have relatively deep penetration in these places, and the image that the US spends a lot of time and money and care projecting about itself is as a bastion of democracy and a global defender of democracy and democratic causes. And in Myanmar specifically, with regards to the US's, support for Aung San Suu Kyi throughout the junta, the dictatorship era, the image that a lot of the Burmese have is this, that the US wants to do these things, and the US is willing to do these things. And then when nothing happened, and we got silence effectively from the US, people got really downhearted. They were heartbroken, really. Like they felt betrayed and they felt abandoned. But the flip side to the coin, and I think this is an incredibly important point, is one of the reasons that as you say, and as a lot of people say, books are going to be written about this revolution, is that the message is now getting through to people that you don't need Western benefactors. You don't
Yeah.
need the
Yeah.
support of the West. You don't need the approval of the West. You
Right.
can stand up on your own 2 feet
Yes.
and you can do this. And I think that is a more like, honestly, as far as the dictatorships in the region are concerned, the prospect of a popular revolution succeeding is much more terrifying than the prospect of a US backed revolution succeeding, because they can keep the US at bay with lucrative trade deals and strategic agreement. You can't keep the people at bay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think again, like that goes back to sort of what I again to kind of the piece that I wrote is that, yeah, again, like I don't think that you were going to see any of that that the US should just be, and all the international kind of actors involved here, just support for the people, right, of Myanmar is kind of, I think, kind of what I was kind of saying, and just looking for is just engagement and support for the people, because like you said, this is certainly kind of a ground up grassroots movement now that has kind of overtaken of course what people I think originally thought was going to happen. And I think you're right. I think the people backed popular part of it, it's certainly from an outside tragic that it's had to happen, but also I think, as you say, kind of a new dynamic and something kind of interesting to watch unfold.
Absolutely. So looking then towards the future, now that we have this situation, I'm sure that the policymakers in the United States and all the analysts are aware of what's going on. They have an accurate picture and a better understanding than we do even. What would the US want to really do, and what tools do they have at their disposal, to be able to achieve that? Because clearly the US is still interested in there being a democracy, and the US is just teetering. It feels like it's just teetering on the edge of recognizing the NUG, recognizing the revolutionary forces. They're just waiting for, I don't know, some magical sign to say now is the time to officially throw away
Yeah.
the and I don't know whether they're waiting for ASEAN to take that first step, because I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know whether they're waiting on the UN Credentials Committee, because I strongly suspect the UN Credentials Committee is kind of waiting on the US.
Yeah.
It's like a bar fight where, like, instead of looking at the dude you're trying to attack, everyone's just looking at the guy next to them to make sure that they're not the first one in line.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just a standoff. So
Yeah.
what is the US going to do?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think there's some domestic things that, or sort of outside of Myanmar things that are at play, right? Now, the situation in Israel and Gaza taking up obviously a lot of sort of the engagement and oxygen in DC. Behind that, probably the Ukraine and Russia thing. I will say, just as an aside, people like to point to those two things and say, "Oh, the U.S. is so busy with this other stuff. There's too much things going on in the world." Both the coup predates both of those things by a year, so there was certainly time for the U.S. to be kind of more focused and interested in Myanmar before those two things kicked off. That's just, like I said, an aside. But I think those two things certainly are issues that are kind of hanging there. I think more kind of in the weeds, you have, the election coming up, and then personnel in the United States. Derek Chalet, who's kind of been, I guess, kind of like taken over this role sort of in doing kind of Myanmar stuff, meeting with the NUG. He's not supposed to be in his job anymore. He's supposed to be at the Pentagon. Because of the U.S. dysfunction, his job has not shifted yet. I'm not sure if it will or if it will be held up, and he'll never kind of make it there. The question then becomes, if he did leave the State Department and go to the Pentagon, would anyone replace him? There's questions about, of course, now that Kurt Campbell's in an even bigger position and the situation in Myanmar has deteriorated even more. Maybe we'll see some more kind of engagement or interest in the country. I'm not, sure that that's going to happen. And then, of course, hanging over all of this is the U.S. election and what happens in November, and if it's a Biden win or if we see Trump come back, and kind of what those two respective policies towards the country would look like, because we're going to get sucked into this election time soon, right? It's kind of descending on us. So in terms of kind of like what the future looks like, I'm not sure. I do think that the Burma Act, there was so much like hype behind that. I feel like, now I don't want to say hype because I know a lot of people worked very hard on it. I know it took a tremendous amount of effort from people on the ground in DC and civil society groups and activists who maybe not always see eye to eye on Myanmar stuff, and ethnic groups to kind of get that through. I do think there was a huge amount internally in Myanmar of hope pinned on that it was going to be, and you saw that kind of hope inflated by bad actors, by people saying like, oh, the U.S. is going to send weapons and gunships and all this stuff. And that's not what it said at all. That's just people kind of stirring the pot.
Yeah.
It's, and then that got caught up in the funding fight, and then the money finally came through for that. So it seems like there is a little bit of, hopefully kind of a tad bit of momentum. And then also, like I said earlier, is that the situation is just getting so bad, externally, right? I mean, Myanmar has always, again, as people on this podcast know better than I probably, claim that this is internal issues. This is, to be settled by the top Topmanah. They're the only people that can keep the nation together, yada, yada, yada. Right now, I mean, that's always been false. And Myanmar's always been a bad neighbor. Now they're terrible, right? You see the meth shipments getting, into Australia. You see, I mean, this has become a transnational kind of criminal state, essentially. And I think that maybe it's just reached this point where, like, look, it's so bad. I think the Myawaddy situation, like, whether that develops into like a bigger gain for the KNU and KNLA, or how that everything plays out, whether it goes one way or the other, just the act of what happened there, I think got a lot of people to be like, oh, okay, this is like, fighting in the jungle, unfortunately, between the KNU and the Myanmar military is been going on for almost 7 decades, right? So I think that's not super kind of new and enough to kind of grab people for looking at, like, media and policymakers and kind of the international community at large. But when you start seeing those images from Myawaddy and right on the border, and you have rumors of the Thai military, putting up their own jets, incursions into airspace, I mean, this is getting, the borders and their inability to kind of the Myanmar military's inability to control its country in that way is becoming hugely, problematic for, like I said, not beyond just the 5 countries that border Myanmar. I mean, you look at the situation in India, it's like, who does the Indian government work with now? Do you deal with the Arkan army and them in kind of on the border, or Bangladesh, I guess? Are they the kind of actors that you go to, or do you go to the Myanmar military? So I mean, I think that all of this, it just seems like I'd say the past month or so, not so much 1027, that operation. Like I think there's a lot more to dig into there and kind of what the actors wanted for themselves. The last few weeks and months so feel like there's more kind of churning than there was before. And maybe we'll see some sort of kind of more cohesive response. And I should say that I have very little faith. I think probably most people who listen to this podcast would at this point on kind of ASEAN and where they're at. I think they have the chairmanship with Laos this year. Has a whole host of issues that it's dealing with in terms of internally, how focused they can be on this. The South China Sea is kind of the overriding big concern for the group. How does Myanmar kind of rank there? And to give some perspective, I went to a talk the other day here in Singapore of the ASEAN Secretary General, the head of ASEAN at the moment, gave a speech here in Singapore, and I went. And, he kind of briefly mentioned Myanmar and said that, it needs to be a Myanmar-owned, Myanmar-led process. I might have that reversed, but that's kind of the phrase now. And then, right when he finished with that, the Russian ambassador got up and asked him about, increasing tourism to the region, and he was super happy to talk about it. And to me, that's kind of like where ASEAN's at. It's like, we want to maybe solve this problem, but also like Russia, who is funding and giving a bunch of weapons to the Myanmar military, is like one of our good friends too. right? And so there's this just kind of crazy, I think, disconnect. And I think you see more and more discussion and questions now about, from the unexpected quarters of ASEAN's relevancy, not just regarding Myanmar, but regarding the South China Sea and the greater kind of competition, with China. I think for a long time, media and people have been critical of ASEAN. Policymakers kind of held out more hope for it. Now, I think you're seeing even some people in Southeast Asia and policy wonks and people saying, yeah, like this is not the strong kind of robust institution that it was. If it ever was, it certainly isn't in that state now. So yeah, that's kind of a long way of saying I'm not 100% sure. I don't think anyone, if anyone tells you they're 100% sure about anything in Myanmar, I think they're lying. But yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like this internationalizing, I guess, of a way of kind of what's happening there might change some people's thoughts or perspective on stuff.
I mean, I agree with your point, and ASEAN's the question of ASEAN relevance is it's a fascinating question that we've been discussing for quite some time. I've certainly made the argument that if ASEAN drops the ball on this, then it's kind of gonna make ASEAN's irrelevance clear, because it's all well and good to have an entity that exists for greater trade cooperation and greater dialogue, but
Right.
people have a sort of expectation in the back of their minds that when things go sideways, the leaders of our countries are supposed to be able to put everything on pause, put the trade on pause, put the diplomatic, handshaking and photographs on pause, and actually sit down and say, hey, hang on, like you crossed the line, like you can't be doing that. Let's resolve this. And they can't, and they don't. And, the European Union gets a lot of criticism for being too integrated into the internal affairs of the constituent member states. I've certainly given a lot of criticism for that. However, it is undeniable that Europe is not in a state of civil war. Myanmar is. And the European Union would have a much stronger and a much faster reaction. I would even argue that the European Union in some ways had a much stronger, much faster reaction to Myanmar than ASEAN did to Myanmar. And I think that it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And it's something that I think ASEAN needs to be made aware of, particularly because you mentioned Operation 1027, but and that operation, made a lot of headway. But the Kachin, the KIA launched Operation 7-3 on the 3rd of March to coincide with the anniversary of I think their founding. We've now got, obviously this liberation of Myawaddy. We've got an interview coming up. It's on the docket somewhere. I don't know when it's going to be published though. From someone who was actually inside Karenni State. He's saying that half of Karenni State has already been liberated, and the other half of the state is gradually being, base by base by base being emptied out. We're looking at actually having a swathe of territory that is free of Myanmar military. Myawaddy was not insignificant, and the thing with Myawaddy is a city. You can't bomb a city into your sphere of control. You can't roll tanks into cities. They're very vulnerable in urban environments. You need to fight on the ground, and the junta sucks at that. If Northern Karen and Karenni State both fall under rebel control, Thailand has got to deal with the fact that you now have a humanitarian corridor, whether you like it or not, on your doorstep. And you are going to have people flooding across that border in one direction, and you are going to have a lot of interest in goods and relief supplies and possibly even weapons and arms flooding in the opposite direction over that border. You can't plug your fingers into your ears and pretend that it's not happening anymore. So I don't know, the clock's ticking, and I'm just not seeing these guys take ownership of the situation.
That's another area that I mentioned briefly in the story, is that, looking at these self-governing areas or kind of governed areas under the control, I know, again, those are complicated in terms of kind of like the structure and who's running them and things like that. But I think that's probably another kind of unconventional way where international actors could be looking to kind of like provide support or aid or kind of, capacity building. I know that's a buzzword that people hate, but that kind of stuff. Yeah, and then also with Thailand, I think we should have mentioned it earlier, and I mentioned it briefly that had moved forward, taken up the premiership and been kind of in control there. Maybe that's another kind of what if, right? I think that they had kind of very different idea of Myanmar policy. It seemed to be something that I met with their foreign policy people right after the election that they were very, very, interested in. Obviously that's a different situation now in Thailand, given who's currently in control. So yeah, another kind of what if there, but yeah, I think you make good points all around there.
I mean, the question then ultimately is going to come down to like what is going to be the tipping point. This I think is ultimately what everything is leading to, because we've got new maps are being produced of effective control. They do not show a rosy picture for the military. I know that the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar is currently working on a report. I don't know exactly when it's going to be released, but I know that they're currently working on an updated report of effective control across the country, in collaboration with some pretty heavy hitters within the Myanmar space, and all signs point to the fact that the military has no path to victory. We've had people coming onto the podcast for months and months and months now explaining that even if the revolution fumbles the ball, the military is too far gone to be able to establish any sort of control. We can't move back to the pre 2021 status quo. We can't even move back to the pre-democratization status quo. That's done. But no one seems to be reacting to this. Nobody seems to be saying, hey, I want to jump off the sinking ship and either just completely, throw the military under the bus and stay aggressively neutral, or even potentially say, hey, maybe a democracy, a functioning, stable, economically flourishing democracy is not a bad thing. And maybe I want to start reaching out and partnering. When just not seeing that, I'm just wondering, like, what is the tipping point? What is going to make it finally happen? Or is it going to be a situation where Myanmar is fully liberated, it is under NUG control, and you still have Southeast Asian nations stubbornly refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the democratic government?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's in a for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, right? It's a like I said, it's tried these quiet diplomacy things for a while with Indonesia, which seemed to actually give it a try. I mean, I think people just generally have much less faith in Laos to kind of carry that on or kind of make headway there. So I think it's kind of like you said. I think it's going to be kind of internal, and I'd also agree with what you said that, and I think that's part of what I was trying to say in the story too. Is that the U.S. approach and everybody's approach is not, you have to start thinking differently, because like what you said is Myanmar's not going back to what it was. What it is in the future, I don't think we obviously don't know, but I don't think it's going back to what it was in the 2012 era. I don't think it's going back to what it was in the 2003 era. Something fundamentally is changing here, and I think it's probably going to take a while for that all to kind of be seen and be sorted. And unfortunately, it's probably going to mean more kind of lost lives and destruction and stuff. But I do think that something different is going to emerge from all of this.
Once again, so your article, I want our readers to be able to find it. We'll link it down below. It's called "The Great Democratic Success Story That Wasn't." Subtitle, by the way: America can't deliver Myanmar from its dictatorship, but it can do more than shift the burden and look away. Which, yep, I have absolutely no comment on that. That is a very, very true statement, and something that I wish people within the administration were taking much more to heart.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say that thanks first for having me on, and and for the podcast. I think despite what kind of drove it to this and all the interesting guests that you've had, because of the situation and the coup. But I think that it's good for places like yours and other places for so many new voices to kind of be recognized and to be kind of come out of of what's happening. Again, it's unfortunate that that's kind of what had to drive it, but it's great to see platforms like yours and others that are out there thriving and kind of giving new ideas and new voices and new thoughts about Myanmar, to a kind of bigger audience. Again, unfortunate that it had to come from the coup, but glad to see that you guys are doing well, and I hope that you guys continue to kind of put up people that know a lot about the place that are kind of working in different areas and kind of, again, just kind of new and diverse kind of thoughts. Sometimes I think, sometimes Myanmar has been kind of held the talking points of a select few kind of people here and there. And it's good to see more kind of people being platformed and being able to kind of, share their thoughts about the country. So, yeah.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you just kind of zone out or skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you're taking the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more than the conversation itself. But so much more goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guests, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is completed, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode into your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and social media. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode informs you about the ongoing crisis, and if you find it of value, we also hope that you might consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Potaba Yarananga Yaunana, Dadu Yadana Gadamana, we got a Besayana, Besaya. Oba Yarananda, Dayananga, Yarana, Dayana, Potaba, Yarana.